So in this lesson, we'll be looking at the effects of prohibition in Canada. Now, in many societies, there's debate between whether to deal with the abuse of drugs and alcohol primarily as a healthcare problem or as a criminal issue. And throughout history, a variety of approaches have been attempted with varying results. Today, we will explore the prohibition of alcohol in Canada in the 1920s and evaluate why it was unsuccessful. And in order to do that, we'll be answering the following questions. What was prohibition? Why was prohibition introduced? What were the effects of prohibition? And why didn't prohibition last? Now to start, what was prohibition? Now, prohibition in general refers to the ban on the production, import, and transportation of any product or service. Now, in the 1920s, we're talking about the prohibition of alcohol, but we still have prohibition of many products in Canada today. Think about the prohibition on illicit drugs, the prohibition of prostitution, or the prohibition of certain kinds of gambling. The same thing was going on in the 1920s with alcohol. And this is something that popped up across all of North America. We saw many states in the U.S. starting to pass prohibition laws, and in 1919, the U.S. government passed an amendment to their constitution prohibiting all sale of alcohol. And in Canada, this started during World War I. We saw different provinces starting to outlaw the sale of beer, wine, and liquor. And by the 1920s, alcohol is illegal pretty much all across of Canada. Now, why was prohibition introduced? Now, the push for prohibition did not come out of nowhere. It had been building for decades and was supported by many groups. Now, in Canada, alcohol had been a problem for many people in the early part of Canada's history. Many Canadians thought it shouldn't be allowed to destroy more lives. And we can see that in this advertisement on the right side here. It says Daddy's in there, and there's a mother and her young child, and they're looking inside the tavern. And you can see it says wanted, a father, a little boy's plea. So an advertisement for this is trying to show that alcohol is destroying this family's life. And this was a concern that many people had in Canada. So you had men who would go off and they'd work all day, perhaps they work in a factory, they'd get their money, and then they would spend it all at the tavern. They'd go out, they'd drink all night, they'd come home drunk, they wouldn't spend any time with their family, maybe they're violent with their family, and they don't have money to support their family anymore. So clearly this advertisement here is trying to make you feel guilty if you're the man who's out spending all their money on drinking. Or if you're a woman, it's trying to get you to oppose people drinking because you don't want to be the mother put in this position. Now, many groups opposed the sale of alcohol and were in favor of prohibition. There were many women's groups that opposed the sale of alcohol. Now, that's not to say that all women were opposed to alcohol, but we had many women's groups springing up around this time. Remember, this is when women start to get the right to vote. So they began to speak up and form groups to campaign strongly against the use of liquor. And because they now had the right to vote, this gave them more clout to lobby politicians and to go out and to vote at the ballot box in order to push these policies. You have the temperance movement. So temperance is a religious opposition to drinking. It's the idea that it's immoral to drink at all. And many church leaders and religious politicians spoke in favor of temperance. The temperance movement had been around for a while. This was not a new thing. It was very prominent in the late 1800s. But now you see these types of groups getting more say in terms of trying to push prohibition forward. There were others who opposed alcohol on purely moral grounds, without any religious overtones. They believed that it promoted bad behavior and they wanted it stopped. So these people we could call teetotalers, someone who believes in the complete abstinence from drinking. Not just that you can drink in moderation, but that you should not drink at all. Farmers were also opposed to the sale of alcohol. Farmers did not want the evils of the city coming into the country. They thought that prohibition would stop it, and they voted for prohibition. So this is also important to remember. This is a time where cities were rapidly growing. The 1920s were the first point in Canadian history where over 50% of the population lived in an urban area. So those in rural areas felt pressured in many ways. They saw life changing around them. They no longer made up the majority. So they saw prohibition as one way to stop the vices of the city from invading rural life and as a way to try to stop this change from happening all around them. So many of these economic anxieties that we see in rural areas came out in terms of trying to push for prohibition. There were also many employers and business leaders that supported prohibition. With assembly line and shift work, employers needed their employees alert and ready. So employers didn't want their employees showing up to work drunk or hungover because that meant that they weren't going to be as productive. Or if they show up drunk, maybe they're going to prove to be a liability. They could hurt themselves, they could hurt someone else, or they're simply not going to get their work done for the day. So you saw a lot of business leaders promoting this idea of prohibition in order to try to get more out of their workforce. Now, what were the impacts of prohibition? There were some benefits. For one, this led to less public drunkenness. You had fewer people wandering the streets at night who were drunk, getting into fights with one another or causing trouble. You had less domestic violence. That saw a decrease after the introduction of prohibition, as you had, fewer men going home and being violent with their families because they weren't drunk. Some of those problems that we saw in the cartoon earlier in terms of men going and spending all their money on alcohol and getting drunk after work, we would have seen a decrease in that as well as the prohibition laws came onto the books. Now, just because it was illegal, it didn't mean that everyone stopped drinking. There was still a pretty large market of people who were willing to buy alcohol. So even though we had these groups who were speaking up against alcohol and voting in favor of prohibition, there was still a large segment of the population that didn't see a problem with this. And despite it being illegal, they tried to find many ways to work around the law. One way that they did this was through speakeasies. Now, these were secret bars that were opened up in people's cellars or in the back rooms of restaurants where people could go and buy alcohol. So you can see here, this is a representation of a speakeasy on the side here. So you can see there's a band playing, there's people dancing. It's like a giant party. And in some cases, these speakeasies weren't so secret. They might have been almost out in the open, and the police might have turned a blind eye to them. In other cases, they were fairly secretive. You would need to know a secret password in order to gain entry into them. Another way that people tried to get around these laws was through bootlegging or making their own alcohol at home. Now, there are many dangers associated with homemade liquor. For one, it's not regulated or tested, so it could be stronger than you intended it to be. And if the alcohol is of a higher proof than you meant it to be, instead of being, 40%, it's 60% or 70% alcohol, you could be drinking what you think is a moderate amount of whiskey and end up getting really drunk off of it. Alternatively, there could be impurities in it. Maybe the ingredients they used weren't the greatest, and this could make people sick or worse as well. So again, because alcohol was not legal to produce, you didn't have reputable businesses making it, and as a result, people drinking didn't necessarily know what they were consuming. This also led to the rise of bootleggers. Bootleggers were smugglers who made thousands of dollars bringing in illegal alcohol across the border. Now, one important thing to keep in mind here is that one of the major problems with prohibition was that alcohol was not made illegal at the same time in Canada and the US. So there was kind of this overlapping period where at one point alcohol was illegal in the US but legal in Canada. So what this meant was that in order to smuggle alcohol into the US, you had these criminals who would run alcohol from Canada into the US. And this was made quite easy by geography. America has thousands of miles of frontiers, so it's pretty easy to do this. It's not like there's a wall between Canada and the US. It's not that there's huge natural boundaries. In fact, for most of the Canada-US border, it's just open fields that you can more or less walk across. So you had famous smugglers like William McCoy who made fortunes bringing alcohol from the West Indies and Canada into the United States. Prohibition also benefited organized crime. The enormous profits attracted gangsters who started to take control of many cities. They bribed the police, they bribed judges, and they bribed politicians. And in some cases, they controlled the speakeasies and the distilleries and ruthlessly exterminated their rivals. One famous case of a gangster who benefited from prohibition was Al Capone. By 1927, he was earning some $60 million a year from bootlegging, and he was infamous throughout North America at this time. His gang was like a private army. He had 700 men under his control. It's estimated that he's responsible for over 500 murders, and he is the orchestrator of what became known as the Valentine's Day Massacre, which took place on February 14, 1929, where his men dressed up as police officers and murdered 7 members of a rival gang, made famous in the movie The Untouchables. Now, why didn't Prohibition last? Well, in short, Prohibition created more problems than it solved. Yes, it did reduce some instances of violence and public drunkenness, but overall it created more problems than it solved. And by the end of the 1920s, there wasn't a public appetite for Prohibition anymore. Most people were okay with the idea of people drinking in moderation and thought that was a better alternative than outright making alcohol illegal. In 1927, Ontario repealed its prohibition law, and it was actually the last province to do so. The other provinces had done so in the years leading up to that. By the end of the 1920s, it's once again legal to buy alcohol in all of Canada. The US doesn't repeal prohibition until a little bit later on. Now, it's legal, but it was heavily regulated. The government wasn't just going to let anybody sell alcohol, so the government had a monopoly on alcohol, and still does to this day in Ontario. The government wanted a piece of the action and began heavily taxing alcohol instead of banning it. And in Ontario, we see the founding of the LCBO, or the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. Now, we still have the LCBO today, but it was not the same retail store that we see today. It's almost like a pharmacy where you would go in, you'd fill out papers in order to order alcohol from the worker at the LCBO. And the government tracked how much alcohol you were buying. And if they thought you were buying too much, they would cut you off. It's a very paternalistic attitude towards alcohol sales. Now, some would argue the LCBO continues this tradition to this day. This sort of system where you would go into the store and you would have to, fill out papers in order to buy alcohol, that lasted up until only a few decades ago. It's only a relatively recent development that the LCBO has expanded to turn their stores into more of a retail outlet where you go and you can pick alcohol off the shelves. That's a recent development. The LCBO also has what it considers to be moral and social responsibilities. So if you walk into an LCBO, there are lots of posters discouraging you from drinking and driving, discouraging excessive alcohol consumption. So they're acting less like a normal retail shop would do, and they're acting more in the social responsibility, as they would call it. But some would call this a paternalistic attitude. So we can still see how some of these ways of thinking from Prohibition still last to this day in Ontario. That's kind of what the LCBO is. They're a remnant of Prohibition that we still see today. So in summary, Prohibition means to criminalize the sale of a product. In the 1920s, laws were passed to prohibit the sale of alcohol in Canada. Prohibition was supported by various groups, including women, the religious, employers, and farmers. Although Prohibition helped reduce some alcohol-related problems, it had many negative impacts, including the proliferation of homemade liquor and the sale of liquor by organized crime. Prohibition was repealed in Ontario in 1927, but it led to the creation of the LCBO that we still see today.